The last person I expected to betray me was my own mother. If someone had told me years ago that the man I hated most in the world was actually the one person trying to protect me, I would have laughed in their face. But that was before a single phone call shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Carson Hale, and for most of my life I believed my father abandoned me. When I was 11 years old, I stood in our driveway holding a duffel bag while my aunt waited beside her truck. I remember begging for an explanation, but nobody gave me one. My mother looked at me with cold eyes and said that nobody wanted me around anymore. My father never even turned to face me. He simply told me to go. That single word followed me through every year that came after. 20 years passed and I built my life around that wound. I became a veterinarian in Montana, spending my days helping ranchers and their animals through emergencies. People knew me as dependable and calm under pressure. What they did not know was that I kept everyone at a distance. I had convinced myself that needing people only led to disappointment. My Aunt Valerie was the only exception. She took me in when nobody else would, raised me like her own son, and became the closest thing I had to a parent. One summer, Valerie convinced me to join her family for a vacation on the North Carolina coast. It was the first real break I had taken in years. The beach was full of laughter, children running through the sand, and family dinners that stretched late into the night. For a few days, I almost forgot the loneliness I had carried for most of my life. Then everything changed with a single text message from an unknown number. The message said only 3 things. Fly home immediately. Tell nobody, it concerns your father. I stared at the screen, confused and irritated at first. My father had not spoken to me into decades. Why would anyone contact me about him now? Before I could dismiss it, another message arrived. This one included my mother's name and the name of my Uncle Vernon. The moment I saw those names together, a feeling of dread settled in my chest. I booked a flight that night without telling anyone where I was going. During the flight, memories I had buried for years began resurfacing. I remembered one specific night shortly before I was sent away. I had walked into the kitchen and seen my mother and Uncle Vernon sorting through my grandmother's financial documents. When they noticed me, their expressions changed instantly. The next morning, I was packed and sent away. At 11 years old, I did not understand what I had seen. As an adult, the memory felt very different. When my plane landed in Nebraska, a lawyer and 2 investigators were waiting for me near baggage claim. The lawyer introduced himself as Samuel Reed. His expression alone told me the situation was serious. We sat in a private office near the terminal, and after a long silence he placed an envelope on the table. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Then he delivered the news that knocked the air out of my lungs. My father had died 6 days earlier. Before I could process that loss, Samuel told me something even harder to understand. He said my father never abandoned me. According to him, my father had spent 20 years protecting me. The investigators explained that my mother and Uncle Vernon were under investigation for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from my grandmother over many years. The fraud stretched back decades. My father had discovered pieces of the scheme long ago, but proving it had been nearly impossible. As the evidence was spread across the table, one date immediately caught my attention. It matched the exact evening I had seen those financial papers in the kitchen. Suddenly the events of my childhood made terrible sense. I had accidentally witnessed something I was never supposed to see. The investigators believed my mother and uncle feared I could expose them. Sending me away had not been punishment. It had been an attempt to remove me from the situation entirely. What broke me was learning the role my father had played. He had known I was in danger. Unable to stop my mother directly, he arranged for my aunt to take me in somewhere safe. To protect me, he allowed me to believe the worst about him. He sacrificed any chance of having a relationship with me because he believed contact would eventually reveal my location and put me at risk. The realization hit harder than any grief I had ever experienced. Then Aunt Valerie arrived. Tears filled her eyes before she even spoke. She admitted she had known the truth all along. Years earlier, my father had begged her to keep his secret no matter how much it hurt. He believed that if I knew the truth, I would eventually return home searching for answers. He was terrified that my mother and uncle would see me as a threat. Valerie hated keeping that promise, but she kept it because she loved me and trusted her brother. Finally, I opened the letter my father had written. Page after page described a man who had never stopped loving his child. He wrote about birthdays he watched from a distance, graduations he celebrated in secret, and every moment, he wished he could have been there. He apologized for the pain his silence caused, but insisted he would make the same choice again if it meant keeping me alive. By the time I finished reading, the anger I had carried for 20 years was gone. The investigation eventually led to criminal charges against my mother and uncle. The evidence was overwhelming. Accounts transfers, forged documents, and witness testimony exposed everything. The family farm, which had been at the center of so much deception, was left to me in my father's will. More important than any land or inheritance was the truth itself. For the first time in my life, I understood who my father really was. Today, when people ask about family, I tell them something I once never believed. The people who truly love you do not always get to explain themselves. Sometimes sacrifices look like abandonment until the full story comes to light. I spent 20 years hating a man for a choice I never understood. In the end, the word go was not a rejection. It was the hardest act of love my father ever made, and understanding that changed the rest of my life.